What's up, Geeks and Gamers? It's Odin coming back with a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw John Wick Chapter 4 open to $73 million, which, hey, Deadline, you actually finally got this correct. This is indeed a franchise record in the domestic because, unlike Deadline, I actually adjust the numbers for inflation to try to make things as fair as possible. And guess what? John Wick absolutely, Chapter 4 that is, was able to beat out all of the other John Wick films when adjusted properly. So we'll go ahead and talk about that and some other films, including a terrible second weekend for Shazam, which dropped a whopping 68% domestically, meaning that film is all but guaranteed to come in well under $200 million worldwide. Let that sink in. A Shazam film, a DC Warner Brothers film, making under $200 million. Yeah, it is, let's just say, it's pretty bad. It's apocalyptic, basically, for the DCEU, and I don't really see how The Flash, other than having the factor of having, Michael Keaton's Batman, is ever going to be able to really recover to the extent that they're going to need a recovery. I mean, essentially, Flash film needs to be about $1 billion film if they hope to have any type or any idea of them having any future really going forward, because if that film ultimately flops and fails, which I think it has a good chance of doing, then yeah, let's just say, put a fork in her. She's done. Let's go ahead and look at the actual numbers for the weekend. As I was saying before, John Wick Chapter 4, a franchise best at $73.5 million, $19,000 per screen. This film is just fantastic. If you are a fan of the John Wick franchise, I think you will enjoy it tremendously. And also, if you are just a fan of action films in general, I think you will also enjoy it because it's essentially non-stop action. Coming in the number 2 spot is Shazam! Fury of the Gods in its second week of release, dropping 68%. We've seen a number like this previously. Remember Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania had the biggest drop of the MCU, dropping 70% from week 1 to week 2. Domestic, Shazam dropping 68%, so doing a little bit better. However, the box offices between them are so night and day that it's just not good for Shazam. I mean, it's not good for Ant-Man either. That film is also losing money, but not nearly as much as Shazam 2 is likely going to end up losing when all is said and done. Scream 6 is also still in the top 3, making another $8.4 million, another 52% drop in its third week of release. Still hanging out still a decent per theater ratio there for a film where the vast majority of its money has pretty much already been made at this point. Creed 3 continuing also to be in the top 5 this week, making another $8.3 million. It'll be interesting to see how that box office gets impacted with one of the co-stars of the film, of course, being arrested for assault. We, of course, will continue to follow that story, as we always try to make very clear you're innocent until proven guilty. But again, things definitely do not look too good, at least at this point in time. And then rounding out the top 5 this week is the film 65 in its third week of release, dropping another 44%. This film is likely going to end up flopping, and as you can see, after 3 weeks, they're already taking out of a pretty large number of theaters. So Sony clearly doesn't have a lot of faith in this film either. I wasn't a big fan of it, and so I'm honestly not surprised to see these numbers coming for the movie. In addition, you also have Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania not making the top 5 this week, dropping another 43%, dropping 700 screens. So Disney, I think, finally is waking up to realize, yeah, no one's really going to go see this movie with all the films set to come out in the next few weeks, especially. So 6 weeks out in this film is pretty much done. So that is pretty sad for the state of Disney and the MCU, which, of course, I know makes me and many others happy, but it's still a sad state nonetheless. That's still a proper expression. Looking at the worldwide totals, as you can see, John Wick Chapter 4 at $137.5 million worldwide, so they're not only claiming it to be the highest ever domestically, but also internationally as well, and I would not be surprised if that was actually the case. I did not have the time to adjust the entire totals and the entire opening weekend totals for all the John Wick films. It's a little harder to track those down sometimes, but they are absolutely right to say it is the highest grossing of the domestic franchise when adjusted for inflation. However, I will say that I think Hollywood in general, not necessarily John Wick, but Hollywood in general might need to be a little wary of the fact that once you have a franchise film and you have a certain number of films, the ability for you to grow that audience becomes more limited as every film goes on. And I think John Wick's totals for this film actually kind of showcase that, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Shazam 2, Fury of the Gods is only at $102.4 million. As you can see, well below any historic margins there, even on the numbers charting. And I'm projecting this film to not even crack $200 million when all is said and done. And when you've got a bunch of films coming out, including the Mario movie, and I know that, of course, that's going to make everyone very happy, including Jeremy, coming out the week of Easter. the week of Holy Week, really, we are going to ultimately see this film pretty much fall by the wayside, and I just don't see this film being able to compete with any of the other films set to come out. You also have Creed 3 at $245 million, so again, film doing very well internationally for sure. However, again, I still don't think it makes the film any better. 65 in the same position, not really that great of a film, $49 million, but definitely not in the same type of financial situation, whereas this film's losing money, Creed 3 was making money, and then Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania is still not going to hit $500 million, which means even based on my much more conservative estimates, this film is going to end up being a pretty decent flop for Disney, for the MCU, and yeah, not a good sign for them in the future going forward. Now, let me go ahead and talk a little bit about the ticket sales for John Wick Chapter 4, because when it came to the original projections for the movie, right, the projections initially were around 65, and then as the weekend was coming in, it was 65 to 70, and then they adjusted it up to 75, and ended up coming in around 73.5. And so it shows us is that these projections that ultimately come in are always a little bit all over the place. And so now these are no longer projections. These are the actual numbers at this point in time. I mean, still technically they're projections, but typically the Sunday to Monday change that usually happens when we get the official numbers doesn't change all that much. If anything, I would not be surprised if this film ended up making a little bit more than 73, but we'll have to wait for those numbers to come in. What you will see, though, is all of these numbers have been adjusted for inflation. And so up until this point, it was actually John Wick 3 who had the record opening domestic, $66.4 million. This film had 73.5. And so with all these numbers adjusted, John Wick 4 is indeed the highest opening of the franchise. And actually, even when you compare tickets, so using the average ticket price for the given year and also the numbers that we have been given, and assuming that the average ticket price for the year is going to be similar to the average ticket price for the opening weekend, even though it likely is probably a higher price overall, we're treating them all the same here and to try to keep it as fair as possible. What you will see is between every single film, a doubling in not only the number of tickets sold, but also, of course, and typically you see this happen too, a doubling in the amounts of money that was made between films also, up until John Wick 4. So you did see still an increase, interestingly enough, you did see an increase in the opening weekend. We'll, of course, wait and see what the second weekend number is going to be like, if just a lot of the people who have been fans of the franchise have been the ones who have been going to see it and are going to go see it multiple times or not. I think that people will, because the film is just really, really good. But what this shows you is that the audience was able to grow between all of these films except for John Wick 4. And the reason why it's not necessarily bad for John Wick, because this film franchise is really set to have a limit to it, right? The creators behind it don't want to make, 10 Fast and Furious films like they're doing with the Fast and Furious franchise. They have an idea that, okay, no, these characters and these stories need to exist within a confined space. And so because of that, this is actually really good news for them. Whereas any other franchise to look at this and say, hey, that's right, we would hope, any franchise would hope to be able to double their audience between films, but there is a limit, right? There is a time when eventually you do get to that cap. And as you can see, there was not a doubling of the audience between John Wick 3 and John Wick 4 because they've pretty much been able to reach the people that are going to be interested in this film, and that's a good amount of people and a good amount of money. And so it's, again, not a bad thing for John Wick, but I think it does give us a better idea as far as any other franchise, looking at you, Ant-Man, looking at you, just MCU in general, about what happens when your audience is not growing and you don't have a actual end in sight for your franchise, as, of course, MCU is set to go on forever, up until, I think, more recently, when maybe they'll have to start rethinking that with some of these numbers. Obviously, you do also have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 set to come out pretty soon, and so that might be able to, give them some new life, but we'll have to, of course, wait and see what those numbers actually look like. Looking at the box office charting, as you can see, the $37 million made by John Wick Chapter 4, based on a $100 million budget, means that this film currently is around $67 million in the red. I suspect this film to be able to make that up, if not by next weekend, then by the following weekend. This film, I don't have any real concerns over it not being able to make its money back at this point in time. It's just performing too well. It is going to start to lose some of the premium format screens because other films are set to come out that are going to take over those spaces. However, I would not be surprised if John Wick is still able to have a hold and attention, not only of people seeing it multiple times, but also people who are waiting for the second weekend, waiting for any crowds to go down as well, as we do typically see that there are people that are second weekend goers, though obviously not nearly as much as the first weekend goers, which is why there's always a drop. Shazam 2, as you can see, though, yeah, not good. $102 million. And as you can see, between its first and its second week of release, it was, again, an opening weekend. And just compare this also, right? $65.5 million opening weekend worldwide for Shazam 2 versus the $137 of John Wick. I mean, even Scream 6 had a higher opening worldwide weekend. But what's interesting is that when you look at the overall projections for Shazam 2, now that I have the first 2 weeks, I'm projecting the film to make somewhere between 146 and 204 by the end of its run. So the average of that would be around 175. So this film does below the historical average, which it likely is going to do because that's pretty much what it's doing right now, this film is going to barely get into the 160s or even 170s range. And really, I would say that that's probably the best case scenario for the film. Looking at the actual numbers for the movie, that means the film's going to be either a $100 million flop or at the very least a $65 million flop. So it's not a good look overall. And this is, again, using a much more conservative metric. My break-even point's 2.5 times the budget. I know that some people's is 3 times the budget. In either case, though, for this and for movies like this, it is not going to end well for Shazam 2. And hey, it's a film that I don't think is the worst film that's ever been released. It's definitely not the worst DCEU film by far, but it is also, I think, a sign that this is what happens when you say to your audience, yeah, screw you. We're going to go with somebody who's worked with the MCU before and made some successful movies, and we're going to put him in charge of our franchise because he's done a couple of films for us that did okay. I don't think the James Gunn thing is going to end up working out for them in the long run, but that is just my own personal take on it. Looking at some of the updates on the box office, though, for some of the other films, as I said, I already projected that 65 was going to end up being a flop. It's looking like that is probably going to end up still holding at this point in time. Champions, no budget yet for the film. Can't speak to it overall. Creed 3 is now $35 million in the black, and so it's still falling within the metrics that I had originally laid out for the film. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is doing so poorly that this film is actually probably going to be a chart breaker in the negative direction, meaning it's going to make less than what I had anticipated the film to make. Not a good look whatsoever. So conservatively, it's at least $20 million in the red, most likely higher than that, though, if you take the average of what I project versus what others project. And those are really the biggest updates to the box office, other than, of course, I will mention it, that Avatar: Way of Water has crossed $2.3 billion. Still not the highest grossing domestic film. That still is in the hands of Top Gun Maverick, but hey, still impressive nonetheless. So what are y'all's thoughts about these numbers? Have you seen John Wick Chapter 4? Do you think it is really good as many of us here on Geeks and Gamers think that it is? And also, what are your thoughts in general about some of these box office movies, including Shazam 2 and some of the others that I've mentioned? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, lap that fire button, Aussie, wherever it is that you're watching us. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed Passion Sunday, and as always, God bless.